Welcome to the State of the Nation Weekly Update. I'm your host, Mike Sham, and this episode is brought to us by Pace Car Rental. If you need to rent a vehicle, Pace are your people. Speak to them. They'll sort you out anywhere in South Africa. They support this show. Support them to keep us on the air. So here we are, a week before the momentous 2024 general election. And with us on the weekly update to discuss what's in the news is Chris Hattingh from the Centre of Risk Analysis. Chris, welcome.
Thanks very much, Michael. Always a pleasure.
And I thought you'd be the right guy to have on, because what we have seen in the last week has been a signing into law of the NHI Act now, right, by President Ramaphosa. And of course, he is dressing this up as normal political business, but in actual fact, it was an undercooked bill that had already sort of, got a lot of airplay because it's going to be challenged in court. And it looks like a straight out election ploy to pass it ahead of the election.
100%. And it looks like one thing to read into it is, what is the ANC's internal polling telling them about how they're going to do? So they could think this is one way to up the vote share. It could also be, from the ideological point of view, the ANC's tactics are well established in this regard. You push very far until you get resistance, and then you scale back and you say you're willing to compromise. But at the end of the day, you still get fundamentally what you want. So you have seen pushback from medical aids, from some corporates, asking questions around how is this going to be implemented. They're saying they're looking at constitutional or at least legal challenges. Over the weekend, according to reporting in the Sunday Times, the president says government is willing to negotiate and discuss and talk about, but at the end of the day, business is still playing on government's turf, so they still get fundamentally the sort of policy that they want. Whether it's enough to sort of push the ANC over 50%, I don't think is the case. I think it's pretty much settled now. The voting patterns, that sort of thing. Things might still change on voting day. It all hinges on voter turnout, of course. But yeah, very much the fact that in the State of the Nation, the president said, I'm looking for a pen,
yes,
to me indicated, he's going to wait until for them the optimal time before the election.
Yeah. Now, just so that we can just set the scene as to some of the issues that are going to, bedevil NHI from this point on, is that it may be unconstitutional, because it's, it's depriving medical companies of their business in many cases. And then, of course, there is the massive impact, and you've written on it, of what could happen to our healthcare sector. Do you want to drill into that?
Yeah, so a couple of areas. Number one, the impact on medical personnel. So let's assume best case scenario, the NHI is implemented in a way that is envisioned by the drafters thereof. It results in equitable access to quality healthcare. Let's assume over 20 to 30 years that happens. But the uncertainty that the drafting of the law, the processes since 2008, 2009, now signing the bill into law, the uncertainty that introduces for medical personnel, nurses, doctors, specialists. Where can you work? Who's going to decide what you get paid? Where's the training going to happen? All those questions are now, the question marks around them are even bigger now. So for you as someone looking to explore working in that area, if you're a student now, do you invest your time, your years, your money into that sort of thing? Or do you ask the question, maybe I should look elsewhere, where there's more transparency, more certainty around policy, there's better returns for me as a medical professional? So number one, the impact on medical personnel. On medical technology, you need not just secure property rights, of course, but secure intellectual property rights in your country, and just the development of research and development, that space for that sort of thing to be on the go. If you, again, have that policy uncertainty around such a massive change of both your public and private healthcare sectors, where is that development going to come from? Are you going to have that massive investment by your companies like Aspen and others in your given country in terms of medical technology? And if you don't, can you import that, for example, if you're sending certain signals in your foreign policy and your geopolitics kind of thing? And then lastly, just the impact on the fiscus. That's, of course, massive. The costing done by the Institute of Race Relations, for example, over the last few years. Some estimates that you need between 200 and 300 billion to run the NHI for 1 year. The healthcare budget doesn't account for that. In the latest budget this year, there was some money allocated, quote unquote, for the NHI, but not really in a substantive way. So there's a way for government to say, look, We're not doing this in a rushed way. We're doing it over time. Regardless whether you do it over a day or 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, it introduces all these uncertainties and issues.
Yeah, and of course, one must see this against the backdrop that I don't think you're going to find many South Africans that want to deny people of their health care.
100%.
Right? I mean, it's in nobody's interests to be in that position. And, heaven forbid, it could happen to all of us. Suddenly you lose your job or whatever, and the last thing you need to worry about is what happens if you break your leg.
Mm-hmm.
So, the country needs healthcare. Yeah. We get it. I mean, that's I don't think anybody's denied it. As far as I can see, one of the things that the government has downplayed dramatically has been the fact that we do have a national healthcare system, right? The majority of our medical facilities are in fact run by the state, and they are in a terrible condition and racked with corruption, right? And we've seen it in just about every metropolitan area except for Cape Town, where at least Groote and those public hospitals still work. But certainly, if you come up to Hattingh, the state of some of our hospitals, part of Charlotte Makeke, the old General Hospital in Johannesburg, which was a massive facility, burning down, and it took them, I think, about 5 years to get that part working again. The government's created a real uncertainty around their ability to deliver. We have heard promises before that there'll be no corruption, especially around medical care, and we had that with COVID, where the self-same president said, nobody will steal money. Well, lots of people stole money and nothing happened to them. So it's not, there's two issues here. One is not that anybody thinks that a lack of healthcare is a good thing. It's a very good thing to have healthcare, but it's just that nobody trusts this government.
And across the board, you'll get from medical professional councils, representatives, associations, from experts like Professor Alex van den Heever at the University of Wits, talking about the question is around whether the NHI addresses these issues in public and private care. It's not to say that there aren't issues in the private medical space, for example, with medical aids, with the rates they charge, what are the inefficiencies that can be fixed. But the burden of proof on the state, I think, hasn't been shifted since the state capture years, arguably even before then. What reason is there to think that this won't result in that level of corruption? It's not a guarantee that it will happen, but when you introduce that level of centralization, when you've got an NHI fund, you've got an NHI board. The people who sit on that board are appointed by the Minister of Health. That's not to say the current Minister of Health is corrupt in any way, but any future Minister of Health will have that kind of power over public and private care. The incentives are there for more corruption. So if you introduce those incentives and those systems, the possibility is there for corruption. It reminds me of what the former CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, said around non-value adding intermediaries. Who gets the tender to build a hospital, run the hospital? Who gets the contract to provide medical kits, all that kind of thing? All of these things, you then add that possibility in many small ways for more corruption.
And I want to just lastly deal with the fact that must be remembered in this whole thing, is that, when you have your kids and you want to send them, give them a profession, one of the safest professions to take up is something in healthcare because it's completely transferable. If you become an accountant, you're still going to have to learn the accounting principles and the tax codes of that particular region. The same with law. Engineering, you have different geographies and things like that. But healthcare is a completely transferable skill. And we've seen it. It's not just about doctors. We've seen our nurses being ransacked by the first world. And you do run the risk now of us absolutely hemorrhaging trained medical staff.
Yeah, 100%. We add to that pain threshold again of remaining in South Africa. So that's not to say that every nurse or doctor will leave or will look to leave, but this raises questions for them around that. And why shoot yourself in the foot in something as important as healthcare, especially? So South Africa, again, has these policy choices within its own ambit. It's not like someone is imposing this on the country, or it's an event that happens around the world like COVID or the global financial crisis. Yes, those things happen to you and you need to plan accordingly. But this sort of thing is within your ambit and you're making the wrong choice.
Yeah. Now, Chris, what we have seen, and we've had it on the State of the Nation, is we've seen people from formal corporate South Africa, let's call it that way, absolutely rushing to the government's aid, sitting in their corner, paying for everything, in the hope that government, what's that thing, you sort of pet the lion in the hope that it eats you last, that kind of thing. Well, this might have some serious implications for public-private partnerships, which could be the death knell for that, because why would you work with a government who's going to betray those people who thought they'd bought the government?
I believe in her latest newsletter, Busisiwe Mavuso from BLSA this week raised that particular question. What is the signal from government side around triple Ps, the willingness to engage with government in your areas like energy, logistics, crime? You've had progress in some of those in some ways, and the introduction of new regulations. They're not being pushed as far as one wants and as quickly because you want actual reform to happen. But now this again asks the question, you engage in the entities like NEDLAC, Booster and others, you sit with government and labor around the table, you as big business. Are they really bringing you on board, or are they sort of using you along the path? And especially now before an election, they get you to work with them, give sort of your vote of approval in a way in working with them. But what do you demand in terms of concessions? When do you walk away or not? Where is your red line? It's often the case that government is the sort of the setter of agency and the setter of the agenda. And then business feels maybe it should just go along.
Well, I must admit, I'm delighted that this at last could break that terrible relationship, I feel, and I've said it many times on the State of the Nation, a terrible relationship between business and government, where business just automatically goes and comes to government's aid at every time they make a mistake. We keep on returning bad government in our elections. Things are going to look very different in 2029 because government, by doing this, and it's not only this, we've got the Bella Bill. There's been other legislation passed just ahead of an election, which really goes to show, hang on, you've got this Rottweiler in your backyard. It's attacked other people. Don't bank on it always not attacking you. And in fact, best case scenario is that you build a nice wall between you and that Rottweiler.
Yeah, and if you're going to bring the Rottweiler into your yard, what do you do around, where do you buy it from? What's your history? What's your research on it? What's its sort of lineage? All that kind of stuff. Do you actually understand what is motivating the government at this point in time? What are the ideological reasons? What are the policy considerations? Are you just focused on the headlines, or are you actually going to your think tanks around the country and discussing with them different interpretations of why the ANC does what it does, for example? So if you don't have that information, then you can't, then afterwards say, oh, I didn't know about this, so I didn't expect this. So again, reporting over the last weekend that business leaders were, quote unquote, and I'm paraphrasing, but caught offside and were caught surprised that the president signed the bill. So the idea is, you say you go and pet the lion, you think you're going to control it and engage with it. But if you don't come with your own expectations, your own demands, when it then turns around and bites you, it's sort of, I guess, on you. Yeah.
Now, we've got to read into another issue here, and there's something that I think needs, some discussion, and that is sometimes you get the impression that the ANC in many of these moves, and this goes back to the expropriation without compensation discussion, where they passed that bill as well. Everybody writes law and does things with something in mind.
Right.
You kind of get the feeling that it's not even thinly disguised. It's really disguised at all. This is very much the ANC signaling the fact that we want to bring legislation in to stop whites from living so nicely. But there is another unintended consequence, and that is that for upwardly mobile blacks, they also won't be able to own their homes. They also won't be able to get private healthcare, and I presume schools are just behind it.
Right? Yeah, especially with something like the Bella Bill, which increases the power of the Department of Education over your private schools as well. So the question is, when you've got a middle class that is growing, that has been growing, not as much as it should have been. I mean, between 94 and 2008, there was substantial progress, and there was economic progress. Your average GDP per capita increased quite substantially. Then you've had the stagnation since about 2007, 2008. And around that time, we had about 14 million people in employment. Just the latest figures, we have 16 million. So we've only created around 2 million in all that time. I mean, what does that tell you about your macroeconomic policies? But when you've got an aspirant middle class and people who want those things that you mentioned, they want them for themselves, for their families, they're aspirational in their lifestyle, they want a good quality of life. It's more difficult to control people who have those sorts of aspirations. So if you can put in policies that make those more difficult, I think then again you can sort of press down on people, you can make them more desperate. Maybe you can then appeal to more populism. So that's also a consideration.
We've got to read this and you mentioned it earlier, and I want to sort of go into this as we head towards the end, and that is that the one thing that's becoming clear from the polling that we've seen and from actions in previous elections is that the ANC is now firmly almost exclusively a rural party, running quite a complex country that's quite industrialized. And, you know, to me, it gives a couple of signals. You mentioned the one, and I want you to go into it deeper, that the ANC might fear that they're in bigger trouble than what they're saying. And the other is that they've given up completely on the urban vote, because really these policies are just designed to hurt urban dwellers, regardless of your race.
And do you think as the ANC maybe that this will appeal to your other voters, maybe your rural base? But even there's a disconnect a bit between sort of communication from the ANC side and your priorities for your average voter. So in our own polling that we do over the last 20 years or so, you see when you ask what are the top 2 priorities for government, the top 2 are always unemployment and dealing with corruption. Now that doesn't mesh with the priorities that your politicians tell you are land expropriation or bigger sort of populist issues. So there's that disconnect where your average South African citizen, rural and urban, tends to be somewhat moderate, leaning a bit conservative. And for them, they're not wanting these radical policies that upend everything overnight. So even there, it's interesting how the ANC might think, yes, it's pushing things and it's going to get an uptick in voters. And I'm not saying it won't help in some way, but not to get the party back to maybe say 69, 70% where it was in previous election cycles.
Yeah, well, it seems like the ANC obviously in the last couple of weeks have rolled out some of the old names. You know, the only thing I didn't do is get the Rolling Stones to play in a concert. Otherwise, I would have had every 80-year-old trying to help them get re-elected. And they trotted out, Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, even Tokia Sokoli, God help him, my word, as to try and push them over the line. What is your reading? Do you think they're going to get over the line? How's it looking from where you're sitting?
I think at the moment I'd go for between 44 and 48%. I don't think still above 50% on their own. The lower the party gets, the more the possibility that someone like the president will be out. So say low 40s, below 40, there'll be much more internal strife and pressure on President Ramaphosa to leave. If they get sort of your upper 40s to 50, they can then form a coalition with your sort of rats and mice. So they don't have to give up much in terms of concessions. They can continue with their policy trajectory. Just on the campaigning, it's interesting in the last week that former President Mbeki is no longer taking part in some of those activities, and he's voiced his concerns around he feels he's being used by corrupt actors and people of that ilk, and he doesn't feel comfortable with that on the campaign trail. So it's the official communication is that he's got African Union commitments, but from his side, it seems still some moral considerations and stresses.
Well, I said I think our last weekly update was that if you just had the sound clip of Thabo Mbeki on that campaign trail without his conclusion, which is, let's vote ANC. And if you change the voice artist, those words could have been said by any of the leaders of the opposition. It sounded like John Steenhuisen in actual fact, because he gives you every reason not to vote for the ANC, and then concludes with, but vote for the ANC, rather like better the devil you know.
100%. And that might also be where many of your voters who have become disillusioned, that they might still fall that way. So at least you've got some element of continuity. You can go with what you have. I mean, it's interesting, in 2019, in the general elections, only 27% of eligible voters voted for the ANC. So there isn't a mandate from, for example, quote unquote, the majority. I know it's a bit reductionist to talk about sort of people in those big blocks kind of thing. But even in that sense, it shows you that the ANC is struggling to appeal to a wider base and a younger base of the population that at the moment is a growing population and is becoming more urban, more educated, more contestation of ideas. This isn't to say that because we've got so many parties on the ballot this year, there's going to be a 5% between all of them. But over time, that is the trend, that things are becoming a bit more disparate and broken up, and there's more competition, as you would want in any marketplace. I mean, between your airlines, even though some airlines recently are calling for crackdowns on others, all those things aside. In your politics, you ideally want more competition.
Yeah, and in closing, you advise a lot of companies, you advise a lot of business people that come to you to find out what's going on in South Africa, whether, what the state of play is and the temperature. We've seen a tremendous boost of the value of the rand. What are you putting that down to?
Yeah, the rand is historically, famously or infamously one of the more volatile currencies around the world. So it fluctuates quite dramatically compared to others. I think at the moment investors are really pricing in some sort of electoral uncertainty. And for them, the best case scenario for the markets, it might not be from a policy point of view, but is an ANC just under 50%, and it can do that rats and mice coalition because your policy continues, but you don't have an uncertainty around like coalition dealing, who gets what position. It takes a long time for the government to be established.
I think we're heading to a Goldilocks election where neither the worst nor the best happens.
Yeah, and at least for investors. Yeah. That doesn't mean for your average citizen things change overnight and that you get your policy reform that you need. But you also don't get a radical lean towards populism, for example. So maybe then by 2029, you really see the ANC then trending towards your your upper 30s, maybe even middle 30%. So as always, whatever the outcome is, if it's your worst case scenario, it's not the end of South Africa. That from an analysis point of view from me would be too easy, I think, to say if this happens, the country is done. There's so much that citizens can do, businesses, civil society, religious organizations now after the elections to ensure that, yes, I'm not saying policy isn't important, but there are lots of things within your control to impact and affect, I think.
And if you're watching this, you're being well informed. Thank you, Chris Hattingh, for giving us the input. Thank you for joining us on the weekly update. Support Pace Car Rentals, support State of the Nation by subscribing and liking the channel. And we will see you again on the State of the Nation weekly update. Thank you.